loading some stuff onto a laptop, but it's not until the end of the direct examination, so we'll just let that run in the background and cover some other things.
Bring this ring.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. Come in. Yes, sir. You got the phone? Okay. Let's all rise for the jury.
Yep. Appreciate it.
That's 69 degrees. Please be seated.
Proceed. Call your next witness.
Detective R.B. Smith.
Please be seated.
Detective, if you will, introduce yourself to the jurors, spell your first and last name for the court reporter.
Yes, I'm Ronson Bridges Smith. My first name is R-O-N-S-O-N. Middle name Bridges, B-R-I-D-G-E-S. Last name Smith, common spelling.
I just called you by R.B. Smith. People that know you call you R.B. Is that a nickname you go by sometimes?
Well, yes, by my initials.
Okay,
Yes.
very good. I want to ask you a little bit about your background. Can you first tell these jurors where are you employed?
I'm employed by the Cobb County Police Department.
And how long have you worked for Cobb County Police?
I'm in my 25th year with Cobb County.
What's your current assignment with Cobb County Police Department?
My current assignment is in the high-tech crime squad.
Do you work with Detective Yeager, who he's now retired, and Pamela Colson? This jury's heard from those two witnesses, both retired. They're both formerly employees that worked with you in the high-tech crimes unit.
They were co-employees of mine in that unit. I was assigned in there in 2009, and both were already in the unit when I arrived.
Having already told us that you've got this pretty significant length of time with Cobb Police, but have only been in high-tech in 2009, I want to ask you a little bit about your background as a police officer. Why don't you explain to the jury how you started with Cobb County Police Department, and then how you ultimately transitioned into the high-tech crime unit?
Certainly. In 1991, I joined the Cobb County Police Force, went through the Mandate Academy, went through Advanced Police Sciences, a course that Cobb County required at the time, and then went on the road, assigned to our South Precinct, which is in the Mableton area of Georgia, around Six Flags, if you're familiar with that area. I worked in uniform, various shifts, out of Precinct 2 for approximately 6 years, maybe just under, before I requested transfer to detectives. And so in 1996, I was granted that and moved to an investigative unit in our Precinct 3. And that was a criminal investigative unit, investigating things like entering autos, thefts, burglaries, that kind of thing.
And then eventually did you move into the Crimes Against Persons unit as well?
Yes, after a relatively brief time, a couple of years in CIU, in 1998, I was assigned to the Crimes Against Persons unit, or robbery homicide.
And how long did you work in that unit before starting with the high-tech crimes unit?
So from 1998 until 2009, when I transferred into high-tech, I was part of the Crimes Against Persons unit.
What sort of training, education, and experience do you have that now qualifies you to work in the high-tech crimes unit?
So my initial transfer was based on some skills that I developed from about 2002 through 2009, and that was working with surveillance video. Many of the cases, as you can imagine, out of the crimes against persons unit, robberies, homicides, serious violent crimes, many of those had surveillance video that was needed to be obtained and then analyzed, utilized for casework. And so I did quite a bit of that. Really beginning in 2002, I actually began educating myself through some vendor training in what was called forensic video analysis.
And that's something you kind of did on your own while you were working as a detective in the Crimes Against Persons Unit, correct?
Well, yes, I wouldn't say on my own, but I would say I kind of championed an idea that we needed to be able to do better with video that we were receiving as evidence. And so to move from just using a standard VCR to watch, this was in the analog. Most of the video we were receiving was analog VHS cassettes. And so rather than just viewing it on a video cassette playback deck, I suggested that we should move towards a nonlinear editing system where we would digitize that evidence such that it wouldn't get any worse, particularly with the analog videotapes. So,
as technology progressed, did you continue to educate yourself about different surveillance systems that might be available at different businesses and different locations?
yes. So after taking some initial vendor training on some equipment we purchased, I also joined an organization called LEVA, and for a couple of years I would go to their training seminars where we would be taught through seminar, lecture, workshops, and I began following through with some additional training in that particular field of forensic video, both in the recovery of that as well as in the analysis of it, image comparison and those types of things. And eventually we began to see the advent of digital video and digital video recorders or network video recorders became more prevalent, and it somewhat changed the way we were operating, and it became more important at that point, the acquisition process. The moment of acquiring that surveillance became much more important rather than just picking up a video cassette. It became really important to understand what was happening and the version or the format that you were obtaining the video in when you first get it.
After getting this specialized training in surveillance video, did you sort of become the go-to guy with your unit when it came to a case where they had video surveillance that they thought might have some evidentiary value?
Yes, and I began ultimately working supporting the investigations of a lot of my fellow detectives, which made it incumbent at some point that I move to another unit where that could be, I wouldn't also be investigating homicides. One of my last cases in that unit was a homicide, and it just became overbearing to try and help support other cases and conduct investigations. So,
with the high-tech crimes unit now, you're able to have that support role in that you don't have your own criminal investigations that you're typically involved in. You're more supporting other units as needed.
that is correct.
Okay. And have you had additional training and education and experience dealing with acquisition of data, extracting data from, say, cell phones and other electronic devices?
Yes.
Tell the jury about that, please.
And in 2009, when I moved over to the high-tech crime squad, I had quite a bit of training in forensic video analysis and sought to create another role for myself whereby I could assist the high-tech unit. They had not been doing video before, so this was, it wasn't going to in any way help their caseload and their support function. So one of the things that they were involved in, number one, they conducted computer forensics. Another area was the mobile device forensics or cell phones, tablets, and those types of items. And so I sought to get some basic understanding of computer forensics. Took a 101 and 102 course at a forensic institute at the Mississippi State University. They had for law enforcement only, I believe it was a week-long course where you took both for a basic understanding of some computer forensics data recovery. And then I began working with our software that we had in place. We had a couple of vendors at the time, Celebrite and Parabon, and a couple of tools that were common to use in the industry. BitPim was one of those, which didn't really have, it was an open source tool.
Okay. And these programs that you've talked about, particularly Celebrite, this jury's already had the benefit of hearing a little bit about that, so they know already that that is a program that can help with the extraction of some cell phone data. What about EnCase? Are you familiar with that as well?
I am, to some degree.
Okay. And EnCase deals with computer as opposed to cell phones, is that correct?
Yes.
And have you been tendered as an expert and given testimony about these topics that we've just discussed, including video surveillance acquisition and analysis, and the analysis of electronic devices to include cell phones, mobile devices, as well as other electronic devices?
Specifically in the avenues of forensic video analysis and acquisition, and as it pertains to mobile devices.
Tender Detective Smith is an expert in those topics at this point, Your Honor.
Admitted? Well, not admitted. He may so testify.
Okay, thank you. With that understanding, I now want to direct your attention to this case. We don't need to go through all of the things that the high-tech crime unit does because this jury's already heard that, so they've got an understanding. But I want to walk you through specifically one of the first things that you were asked to do in this particular case, focusing on a Chick-fil-A location. Were you called upon at some point to do something in terms of a Chick-fil-A location?
I was.
And why don't you explain for the jury what it is you were tasked with to do in this investigation back in June of 2014?
To respond to the location, the Chick-fil-A, and to acquire some surveillance video from June 18th, 2014, and a particular time frame between 8 and 9:30 a.m.
Okay. And this is State's Exhibit 230. And looking at State's Exhibit 230, I'll let you get acclimated. Do you see that this aerial surveillance photo includes a Chick-fil-A as well as Little Apron Academy, a Home Depot, and a Publix?
Yes.
Do you recognize this as being the Chick-fil-A that you responded to near Paces Ferry Road and Cumberland Parkway?
Yes, it is.
And is that in Cobb County?
It is.
And were you able to actually go to that location and acquire some video surveillance from the morning of June 18th of 2014?
I did go to the location. I did make an assessment of the system. The managers there were very adept at utilizing the system, so I didn't actually perform the acquisition. I stood by as they were familiar with the time segment that had already been reviewed. I think some other detectives have been there, so I asked them to go ahead and perform that acquisition and export the video.
Export the video to a disk that you can take back as part of your responsibilities.
That is correct.
So I want to ask you a little bit about acquiring these video surveillance recordings in general. When you go to a location, are the times of the video surveillance always accurate that are timestamps on the recordings, or is that something that you have to check as part of your responsibilities?
It is something that must be checked. And in many, many instances, there are significant time differences between the time stamping that the actual equipment is displaying for, in particular, DVRs, just like a black box DVR, or in some cases, some computer system, PC-based surveillance platforms. The time setting is off on the equipment, and so you have to make an assessment of that time based on real time and have to have a starting point to work with so that, number one, so that I can search for a video segment. Now, many times I'm there pretty quickly after an incident, so it's not as hard, but if the date and time are off badly, it can make it very difficult to search the system.
If it was off, say, for an hour or so, say the system was not accounting for daylight savings time, for example, if you got the wrong hour, you might miss entirely what you're looking for.
That's correct.
So in this particular case, what did you do first to assess the validity of the timestamp on the sought-after video from the Chick-fil-A location that you've given testimony about that's depicted in States 230?
So this was a standalone DVR. It's a GE system, Store Safe Pro system. The system was displaying a live view at the time. I was escorted to the back by the managers, and I just made a note reflecting with my cell phone. I was looking at time.gov, and so time.gov was providing a time through the National Institute of Standards testing, and what I was seeing was at that time I believe it was 3:53 in the afternoon.
This was on June the 23rd of 2000.
This was June 23rd. And so I made a note, and then as I noted that, I look up at the live screen and make a note of what is being displayed on the DVR, which was, in this case, 3:53 and 33 seconds, so approximately 18 minutes and 30 seconds.
So their system was 18 minutes and 30 seconds off in terms of the date stamp that was on the video. Is that correct?
In terms of the timestamp, the date was correct.
Just the timestamp that we're talking about. Thank you for correcting me on that. Okay, so having notated that, did you go back and look for, and were you able to obtain some video from staff there at Chick-fil-A that covered the time period in question here, accounting for the fact that the timestamp is going to be off by 18 and a half minutes?
Yes.
We already have it in evidence, States 238, and you had an opportunity to look at 238 earlier, correct?
Yes.
And just so the jury can see, 238 has been previously marked, tendered, and admitted as the Chick-fil-A video surveillance. Whose initials are those on the evidence tape on the top?
That's my handwriting, and those are my initials.
So on the disc itself where it says June 23rd, 2014, R.B. Smith, that's
Yes.
your handwriting, so that you would recognize this in court as being the actual video surveillance that you obtained, correct?
That is correct.
All right. You also had a chance to look at States 248, which is a thumb drive.
Yes.
That includes some still images on it as well. Did you recognize one of those still images being the defendant from the morning of June the 14th, June the 18th of 2014?
Yes, and still images, yes.
And that's a still image that was captured on the video surveillance, the entirety of which is on 238.
Correct.
I want to show you one of those still images. Chick-fil-A still images. And I'm going specifically to States 241. Expand that a little bit. All right, can you see that from there, or do you need to come down?
I can't.
Okay. I don't want to move this for the jury if I don't have to. I trust everyone can see it good enough? Okay, very good. So if you look up here at the top, you see that this contains the date, June 18th of 2014. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then up here on the date stamp, it says 9:18 and 13 seconds in the morning, a.m. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. So having given testimony now that that's going to be off by 18 minutes and 30 seconds, is that correct?
1833, or 1830 was approximate.
I'm terrible at math, so help me out. What's the actual time? What do we need to adjust this by to know the actual time that this purchase is being made?
So that is approximately actual time with the offset calculated for. It would be 8:59 and 45 seconds approximately.
Almost 9 o'clock in the morning.
Yes.
Is that correct? Just seconds beforehand.
Yes.
And of course, whatever length of that transaction is, you could be between the 8:59 going into the 9 o'clock hour. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, were you also able to bring to court with you a receipt from evidence we've already heard some testimony about. I'll show you states 401.
Yes,
A Chick-fil-A receipt.
yes,
Okay, and you brought that to court from Cobb Evidence when you came down to Glenn County with you, correct?
I did.
Tender states 401.
I have one here. Mr. Smith, you said we transported these from Cobb Police Headquarters where this piece of evidence was stored?
Yes,
You didn't collect these from the business?
I did not.
Do you know when they were collected from the business?
I'm not aware.
The initials here on this envelope, those aren't your initials, correct?
They should not be, no.
Judge, I am going to object for lack of foundation.
Oh, Detective Ascanio testified about going to pick up the receipts, but that's fine. We'll tender with another witness. We can talk about receiving them from Detective Ascanio. We'll wait for Detective Stockman.
Thank you.
I will ask you a question about these receipts, so you don't have to come back to Glenn County, though. Looking at 401, if this receipt doesn't reflect that the transaction took place right within this time period you just gave testimony about, right at approximately 9 o'clock.
Judge, I'm sorry, I am going to object to any questions about the evidence since it had not been admitted.
I haven't asked the question yet.
Judge, he is, that's why I'm objecting.
I'm gonna hear the question before I make a ruling.
If there's a difference between the time on the receipt in states 401 and the time that you've given some testimony about from the video surveillance that you've just saw here, the receipt time would also need to be adjusted to reflect the 9 o'clock hour based on what you saw at the Chick-fil-A yourself.
Yes.
Okay. Give that to you for Stockman. All right. Other than being off by about 18 and a half minutes, which we can calculate if we need to get the exact time, was the system otherwise functioning?
Yes.
And did you provide that disk to Detective Stoddard as part of your investigation at Beat State 238?
I did. I returned to headquarters and submitted the disk I received to evidence made and actually burned copies first, provided copies to Detective Stockton.
I want to
Submitted the original to evidence.
Right. I want to ask you a little bit about, still loading, so I'm going to talk about a couple things. I want to ask you about some other work that you did in this case. There were a number of electronic devices this jury's already heard about that were seized from the defendant's vehicle and some devices that were seized from his home. Are you familiar with the fact that there were a number of electronic devices that needed to be analyzed, including some cell phones?
Yes.
Okay. And in this particular case, did you have occasion to actually do some extractions of some of these devices yourself as part of your work with the high-tech crime unit?
Yes.
And I want to talk a little bit before we get into the specific devices about UTC. This jury's heard a lot about UTC and Uniform Time Coordinated. Explain the importance of understanding UTC because we live in the United States.
It's the basis of, from where we start with time, establishing a time, so that we can denote time issues in any kind of documents, records.
So because we live in the Eastern time zone, do you sometimes have to adjust UTC to account for the fact that we live in the East as opposed to where UTC 0 would be?
Yes.
And because America and just other countries as well have something called daylight savings time, you're familiar with that, correct?
Yes.
Are there times that UTC must be adjusted to either -4 or -5 depending on what time of the year you're in?
Yes. For our location is UTC, we recognize, we're Eastern time zone, recognize UTC -5. And then for daylight savings time, that becomes UTC -4. That daylight savings time, of course, occurs the first weekend of March on Sunday at 2 a.m. and the first weekend of November again on Sunday at 2 a.m.
All right. Now, does the acquisition system Celebrite allow you to adjust UTC so we can make sure we're getting an accurate timestamp from devices once data is extracted?
Yes. The settings on the system can be set to UTC 0 or UTC -5.
All right. I want to ask about several devices that you looked at in this particular case. But before I do that, I want to ask you about cellular networks. You and I had a discussion about the difference between, say, surveillance timestamps versus cellular network timestamps. And can you explain to the jury why one might be of more accuracy than another?
Well, the time for cellular devices, they're reaching out, touching a network, and those timestamps on the device, if the device has been reaching out, touching the network, should be relatively accurate based off of the network time.
As opposed to surveillance video where there might require some manual input?
Yes, many of the surveillance systems are not plugged in or connected to a network. They are standalone devices that are set by presumably someone who initially sets the system up or someone who should be doing maintenance or maintaining the system. And that is something that should get checked. But in many cases, a lot of the systems I deal with are mom and pop locations, convenience stores and businesses. And frankly, once it's set up and it's recording, they may not revisit it for quite a while.
To be doubly accurate for the issue of call detail, when phone calls are made and when messages are sent, by obtaining the actual records from the cellular service providers such as AT&T, could you check that against the manual handset to make sure that they're recording the times accurately?
Yes, and not only can you, but that is the best practice.
And that's fairly routine that we would do that in our investigations.
It is routine for investigations.
I want to ask a little bit about, just generally speaking, extracting information from devices. What's the difference between the extraction versus the analysis of the extraction?
So in most of the cases, the extraction occurs using a piece of hardware provided by Celebrite. And that piece of hardware has some proprietary commercial software running. And that software application, we don't know much about how that is written. Their software engineers know that. And so the extraction occurs, and that is just a bulk of data, depending on what Celebrite is currently supporting from a particular device by make and model. And there are thousands of devices, and there are hundreds, a large number of different configurations that Celebrite will write in-scripting for to communicate with devices. Their piece of hardware communicates with mobile devices of different manners, different types.
And then once extracted, what do you use to actually read or analyze the data that's removed from the device so that you can take a look at it?
So if there,
I should say that it's not actually removed, it's copied from the device, correct?
So in most cases, yes, it's not removed from the device. Celebrite doesn't write to the device. Celebrite communicates with the device and makes an acquisition, an extraction of a set of data, and then that can be in our office. We point it to storage drives. It is stored as a particular type of file, and then that file is then we point to that file with another piece of software also provided by Celebrite called Physical Analyzer. And the Physical Analyzer software then begins to decode the data and make it such that it will parse the information into various data types, and it may define that very specifically in the case of call logs and incoming, outgoing calls, SMS, text, chats, images. It'll break it out into those different categories.
When you say parse, are you saying that the program's able to look at all of the data and categorize it into different files so that you can say, if I want to look at chats, I'll click on chats. If I want to look on messages or apps, I can go click on that?
That is correct.
And would it allow you to review what's been extracted or taken off of a device?
Yes, as long as it's information that Celebrite will also support it for decoding the way the information is stored.
I want to talk about decoding. That's a very interesting issue that you brought up, and I think you mentioned the word twice now. Are there periodically updates that are provided to you in law enforcement that helps you better decode the data that you've taken off of a particular device?
Yes.
And just explain to the jury in general terms what we're talking about there when we're talking about decoding and software updates.
So in this particular case, speaking of Celebrite provides a number of updates with relative frequency, so much so that it can become irritating. We're constantly updating the system, but that is because they will push out, their engineers will develop their tools farther, such that it will support more and more applications, particularly in the avenue of text, texting apps, social media apps. It's just necessary that their engineers look into and determine how to decode that information. And so it's with some regularity. They also do push out these updates because obviously phones, newer phones and newer operating systems are being pushed out by the various companies that manufacture phones.
We're about to get into a specific example, I hope, this afternoon about an update in decoding. But are you saying that there could be data that's retrieved, say, 2-3 years ago that is better able to be decoded today because of software updates that allow the program to see what, even though it's been retrieved or extracted several years ago?
That is correct. Yes, that is what I'm saying.
Now, I noted in your report going through the specific devices that you looked at, and I want to talk about an iPad and 2 iPhones in just a moment, that you mentioned that you turned these devices onto airplane mode before you attempt any extraction or do anything with them. Is that correct?
Yes.
And can you explain what the importance of turning devices, especially mobile devices, onto airplane mode before you start working with them? Why do you do that?
To keep them from touching, reaching out, and communicating with the network.
All right. At that point, are we able to keep the device basically in a static state so that things aren't being changed on it from the network because it's no longer connected?
To a great degree, yes.
And once an acquisition has been performed, once you've celebrated a device, as long as airplane mode is on, you could access that phone assuming you have the code, and you could look onto the phone physically as well. Is that correct?
You could.
Yeah. And have you actually done that before in some of your cases, looked on devices?
I have.
And is there anything remarkable about doing that, particularly once an acquisition has already been accomplished?
Generally, I would not recommend it prior to an acquisition, but there are circumstances that have prohibited me from accomplishing a data extraction via the data port or the communication port with the device. I've seen where those are damaged. I actually had a case recently that I testified in where that was the case. You could not communicate with the device. The only other way was to go into the device, navigate, and then find a different means of extracting some data.
Okay. And if an extraction is already accomplished from a device, but one were to want to see where particular apps are on the phone visually, as long as it's on airplane mode, one could do that if you have the passcode.
You could.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about some of the devices that you looked at here. I'm going to show you some devices that have already been admitted into evidence. This is State's Exhibit 302, previously marked, tendered, and admitted as an Apple iPad encased from amplifier component bag and back storage area of the vehicle. And I'll ask you just to take a look at this, State's 302, and tell me if you recognize that device.
I do.
Did you do any work on it?
I did.
Why don't you explain to the jury first how you recognize it and what you did with it?
I recognize it because this bears my signature on the evidence tape where I sealed this to return it to evidence on July 11th, 2014.
And next thing that I want to show you is State's Exhibit 301, previously marked, tendered, and admitted as the iPhone with case from Target's laptop bag from front passenger seat of the Tucson. And looking at State's 301, similarly, I'll ask you if you recognize that device, and did you do any work on it?
I do. Much the same as the previous item. It bears my signature on the tape where I've sealed the bag, where I cut the bag to retrieve the item from it. And this was sealed on June the 20th of 2014.
And what did you do specifically with these two devices, States 301 and 302, at the request of Detective Stoddard in the Crimes Against Persons Unit?
I performed a data extraction to the extent that the most data could be extracted. So one was supported for a physical extraction, one was supported for advanced logical extraction.
We've heard a little bit about the difference between logical, advanced logical, physical extraction. So we don't need to get too much into the weeds on that one because this jury's probably heard as much about that as they want to hear for the most part. But just describe for our record a little bit between the difference of the two and why you had to do two different ways on these two devices.
So in some cases it's a matter of what is supported by Celebrite. But in the case of any device, if it is supported for a physical bit for bit, what resides on the memory will be obtained for the extraction that can then be analyzed. That would be the preference, particularly in the case where they're looking for any and all communication or data stored on the device. On other devices, that when they're not supported for that higher level, to the extent that they are supported, we would like to get that to the highest level of acquisition that can be accomplished.
And how is it that you actually performed the acquisition on these two devices? What did you use? What program?
Celebrite.
And using Celebrite, were you able to extract or make a copy of the data that was on these devices?
Yes.
And for the phone in particular, did you turn airplane mode on before you did anything with this device? And just so we can visually see what they look like. This one's got a kind of striped case on it. I'm looking at Stage 301. Is that correct?
Yes.
And this device, we're seeing some pictures of it from a crime scene, but just to show you, it's an iPad that's got a little flip case, maybe leather, faux leather. And that's State's Exhibit 302. When you performed the extraction using the Celebrite program, were you able to burn the extracted copied data to a particular disk to provide to your fellow law enforcement officers of crimes against persons unit?
Well, I was able to provide a report function that gives them the broadest range ability to search, export, and analyze and report on their own. If they're many detectives are in our unit, our various units are comfortable. They've received a number of these, and we've provided the manual. There are online videos that they can watch on how to utilize a reporting function that gives them a great deal of flexibility in what they're looking at, rather than looking at literally 10,000 or more pages if you were to print something out, or if you provide it in like a PDF format. This is more of a graphical user interface. It's more of gives them more flexibility. It's really one of the best ways.
Is it an electronic report that allows you to click through
It
the
is.
different things and messages and chats and those types of things?
It is. So it has a data component that is read by a proprietary reader, and that is something that Celebrite provides.
And we sometimes refer that as the UFED reader, is that correct?
It is the UFED reader.
And this jury's already seen that with Yeager, so I'm not going to bring it up for these two devices at this time. We're trying to load one for another device, but I do want to ask you about State's Exhibit 402. Looking at 402, that disc, can you tell me if you recognize what it is, please?
Yes, I do.
Why don't you describe for the jury what 402 is?
States 402 is a disc that bears my handwriting, indicating the case number. The iPad and iPhone 4S extractions marked as case file copy and bears my signature and badge number.
And is that extraction for the two devices that you just gave testimony about, that being the iPad and the iPhone from the briefcase?
Yes.
And were you able to put both extractions in the UFED reader, the report of the extractions on this disc?
Yes, in the reader form.
It's got your name, your initials, your handwriting on it to confirm that this is the disc you created.
It is.
And this was turned into evidence to be reviewed by detectives later?
That particular copy would have been provided to the detectives.
Tender State 402.
Admitted over that objection.
All right. In this instance with those two devices, were you also tasked with doing any analysis on them, or did you leave that to the primary detectives that were working the case in the Crimes Against Persons unit for those two devices?
I did leave that to them. They requested the data basically be dumped, provided in the UFED reader report format, and that they would, they had a number of investigators that were looking at that.
So in terms of going through 402 to see what was on there or what was on these two devices, you left that to detective, such as Detective Phil Stoddard, with the lead case agent on the case?
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about an iPhone 5S that you did some work on. I'm going to show you State's Exhibit 226, which has previously been marked, tendered, and admitted as the Apple iPhone 5 seized from defendant when he was detained on the crime scene by Officer Piper. Do you recognize that cell phone?
I do.
And at some point, were you called upon to do an extraction on this device and to review it using Celebrite?
I did not conduct an extraction on the device. I did, after the extraction had been conducted, there was an extraction file existed. I utilized Physical Analyzer to export in the UFED reader format report.
Okay. And in fact,
Sorry.
that's all right. You have your signature and your badge number on this exhibit 226. Cell phone recovered from defendant when he was detained by Officer Piper. That's your signature and your badge number on there to confirm that you did some work with this, correct?
Yes.
we have now attempted to load a disk. $397. You were trying to help me with this during the break. That's why we took one, correct?
Yes.
Which is still loading. Awesome.
Well, is it really loading, or is it just doing a little ball thing?
I suspect that it's probably just doing a little ball thing, but I'm not with the high tech users.
Well, you can tell how high tech I am, little ball thing.
Yeah, we're,
But regardless, that might be something for us to look into.
it's
Can
something,
you
Mike.
do something else, or do you need a break?
I can, Judge. Let me get through about as much of this as I can, and
Of course.
we'll see what we need to do thereafter.
Because sometimes we need tech support, that's for sure.
Sure.
You can use my computer if you like. I've got it loaded up and ready to go.
Okay, we might do that. Just confirm for me first, and let me get it into evidence. 397, the disk that's attempting to be loaded on our supercomputer over there, our NASA scientific supercomputer. That disk you created when you did some work on the iPhone 5S that was recovered from defendant when he was detained, correct?
That is correct.
And that information was provided to Detective Stoddard after the initial acquisition of data from that phone by, was it Detective Yeager, do you recall, who initially did
Yes.
the extraction?
It was Detective Yeager who did the initial extraction. Much later, I was asked to do some work with it as well.
Now, I want to talk about that for a little bit. When you were asked to do some work, did you do some work with the device itself, or did you do some work with the initial extraction that Detective Yeager did back in June of 2014?
Both.
Okay? And explain to the jury what you mean by that.
Okay. So the one of the questions that I received from investigators in this case, particularly Detective Stoddard, was with regard to conducting a secondary extraction, another extraction from the device, using a different tool that they had been informed about by, I believe, some other entity, agency in law enforcement had told me.
Before doing that, did you see if there had been a software update since the initial extraction of the data from the phone in 2014 by Celebrite?
Yes.
And because there had been an additional software update, were you trying to see whether perhaps it might allow you to decode more on the phone than had been initially viewed?
Yes.
And why don't you explain for the jury?
So the original extraction created a particular file. That's a .tar file. It's a compression scheme. And it simply is this bulk of data and that can be reopened by even newer versions of Physical Analyzer. So Physical Analyzer is a component that reads the data file and can then parse the information into the data types. And as they push out updates, may support newer applications that it had not previously supported. And in this case, they had pushed out an update. I ran the file against it. This was in early September of 2015, and the file was parsed and did the data type for whisper chats was did show all the text messaging that is a component of the app, which then put those together with the images which had already been seen.
That's an important point. From the initial extraction in June of 2014, the data was already there, is that correct?
That's correct.
And the images, could you see those images using the UFED reader from very early on?
Yes.
What could you not see until the software update? When you started looking at this phone in, you said it was October? When was it that you looked at the phone? Do you have your report?
Yeah, in late October. I'm sorry. No, it was not.
September.
Yeah, it was September of 2015. I was asked to look at it again in the late part of August. There had been some discussion about this particular whisper chat. And we were unable to see the chat application in conjunction with a particular image. had not been decoding, and we couldn't tell from the files which messages would go with that particular image.
When you were able to do this additional analysis, looking at stage 397 once loaded, did it give you the ability to decode the data that was otherwise hidden or not able to be viewed back in 2014 associated with the whisper posts?
It did. It decoded and understood how to pair the image with the text associated with that image or in response to that image.
Yeah. Judge, looks like we're getting close. Can I just have 5 minutes? If it's possible, go from the actual evidence, would be my preference. If not, we can have a discussion about an alternative way of looking at it.
Well, let's have a break.
You get 2 afternoon breaks for a positive side of things. So like glass half full sort of thing.
Close your notepads. Keep your mind open and your mouths closed. That's very rude, but it's very true. Y'all have a good break.
Watch your step going down.
I should ask, do you realistically think that's gonna happen?
And Judge, it actually started,
Here's
started loading stuff up on it, right?
Can we